Thanks for the introduction. We'll start. Could you turn the lights down on me? I call this lecture Almost Everything. It's the name of a book that we produced a couple of years ago now. And to me, calling it Almost Everything is a kind of provocation. A provocation or a challenge about what contemporary architecture can be about and where the content for contemporary architecture can come from. I am most interested in architecture as a cultural activity. Obviously, architecture has technical aspects to it, especially if you're interested in building, which we are very interested in building. You need to have a certain technical knowledge and capacity. But for me, the really amazing thing about architecture is it's the fact that it becomes part of the real world. It becomes part of concrete reality. I'm not interested in it, in that aspect of it, because I'm interested in depositing little Caruso St. John or large Caruso St. John monuments here, there, and everywhere. That's really the last of my concerns. But what's very special about architecture in relation to artistic production is that you work in a particular situation with a particular client. It's a very, very intense operation, engaging with the project, designing the project, and then building it. But then the building becomes part of reality. It becomes part of this wild situation which the architect and even the client no longer has control of. And that's a huge responsibility, I think, for an architect. But also, it means that architecture is a very powerful way of finding out about the world and about that specific situation that you're working in. For me, and I think in Belgium it's similar, to build buildings in Britain today is a real pain in the ass. It's really hard. And we're so neurotic about controlling the process of construction that really I can say most of the projects we've done, the result is in one way exactly what we expected. Yeah, all of the models that we made showed how the space would be and that the real space is that way. But the thing about building the building is you build it and then you go and visit it, and obviously for the first 6 months it's a bit painful to visit it because you only see the mistakes and whatever, and some of them are fixed and some of them cannot be fixed. But then afterwards you notice new things about the space, things that you never expected, things that you never planned for. And the other thing is that you find that the spaces in the building, but also maybe around the building, are being used maybe by the client, but also by all sorts of people in ways that you never planned. And in that way, I think architecture, uniquely amongst the arts, has this capacity to first of all, really embed you in the situation you're working in, but then there's this incredibly powerful feedback about what the effect, like the relationship of the ideas that you had to make this thing, but then the effect that that has on the concrete reality. And, you know, it's kind of a privilege to be able to do that, but it's also, I think it's also just a really interesting thing. And to me, that's the most powerful social aspect of architecture. I don't believe that architecture is a very effective mechanism for social change. I think if one is interested in politics or social justice and things like that, and I am interested in those things, if one wants to make one's life about those things, one should be, a lawyer or a politician maybe, or a doctor, or a teacher. I think there are many things that are much more effective than architecture. But I think the incredibly intense constellation that causes a project to be made is an intensely social thing. And it does affect you as a person if your ego isn't so large that you're insulated from being affected in that way. So I am interested in almost everything. I have very wide interests. But I'm not going to bore you with all the things I'm interested in. We can, in the bar, maybe talk about some of them. But I am interested in a very wide range of architectures. And I would say in the last 3 or 4 years in our office, our main architectural interest has been in the 19th century and in the early 20th century. I have a lot of problems with modern architecture, although just recently I've started to try to understand things about modernism again. And of course, I'm very interested in what's happening now, and I'm always really pleased when I see a new building that I find moving and full of qualities. It's a fantastic thing. But I find the 19th century an amazing time for architecture. It was a time of kind of brutal, laissez-faire economic forces. I would say forces that are equivalent to the forces of globalization today. If you give the relative distance between Ancien Régime society and the beginnings of a laissez-faire capitalism at the end of the 19th century, it's not so different than the kind of, corporatist, positivist economies of the 50s to the 70s going to the global economy of today. They're both huge leaps full of troubling social effect, very troubling. But what interests me about the late 19th century and about the architects of the late 19th century is the way that they managed those forces within the culture of architecture. And I'm just going to show a few examples of certain heroes. Actually, they veer into the 20th century, I'm afraid. The first is a real objective research that I'm in the middle of, which is second half of the 19th century architecture in Chicago. Chicago had a fire in the 1860s. It had a kind of amazing rebuilding program after the fire. It had building regulations that were changing every year, which would allow taller and taller buildings to be built. But it also had an incredibly erudite cohort of engineers and architects, 60% of whom spoke German. That's a kind of discovery I made a couple of years ago. After the revolutions of 48, when lots of people had to leave Germany, many of them went to Chicago. And so the ideas of people like second generation Schinkel-Schule tradition, but also the ideas of Semper, were absolutely common currency in 1860s and 1870s Chicago, which you couldn't say about England, where still today nobody's heard of Semper. Yeah, so a kind of very special combination of a new world, brutal growing economy, very ambitious clients, but then an incredibly sophisticated building culture. I just want to show a few buildings. This is, of course, the Marshall Fields warehouse by Richardson in the mid-1860s, which was the model for how you would make a commercial building in Chicago. It fills a block. It takes a kind of French Romanesque architecture, but blows it up so that it can deal with the repetition in length and in height that commercial architecture at that time required or demanded. And it was the model. It was the kind of project of Chicago architecture. It was actually a warehouse building, though. It wasn't the typology par excellence, which would be the office building, which also came into being in Liverpool in the 1850s or so. The first purpose-built office buildings were built at that time in Liverpool. And 10 or 15 years later, they would start to be the main kind of building that was built in Chicago and in New York and all of the major economic centers. So this is a building that's directly influenced by the Richardson building. It's Adler and Sullivan's auditorium building, a kind of hybrid building which has a 3,500 seat concert hall, a hotel, and an office building in it, where Adler and Sullivan extend the language of Richardsonian Romanesque to deal with even a bigger building, a building which had even more things internally but also externally to respond to. I really love this photograph, a photograph that's by John Swakowski that he took in the 50s, because it's a photograph of South Michigan Avenue, and it shows a row of buildings that all have different heights. There's a few different materials. None of the cornice lines or base lines line through, and yet it's still a picture of urbanity. It still shows a kind of community of architects over probably a 100-year period who subscribed to enough common ground that they were able to make a kind of a city wall. Yeah, that is no longer the case. Nowadays, it seems the last thing architects want to do is subscribe to anything that their neighbor might subscribe to, which I think is a bit of a problem. This is one of Sullivan's kind of masterpieces. It's the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, where Sullivan took the kind of highly conceptual idea of the frame, the steel frame, but also the idea of the prefabricated cladding unit, in this case done in terracotta, which previously was a material that was only used as a fireproofing, a protection to the steel frame. Took these ideas of repetition and elevated them to kind of an unbelievable level. And it's just an office building, this building. But the kind of decorative, the ornamental energy of the terracotta panels is incredible. It's kind of something I could never hope to equal. But what's also interesting is how Sullivan realizes that because these are not cut stone, but because they're terracotta and the joints have to be bigger, that it's not just the seed motif that's significant in the facade, it's also the joints between the panels. Yeah, so that you have this idea of repetition happening at many, many different levels. So on the one hand, the building is an absolute embodiment of mechanization and repetition, and you could say kind of forces of alienation. But on the other hand, it's an incredible example of, the Semperian four principles of cladding, and it's an amazing building. And we went to visit this building with our students from Harvard, who I don't think had ever heard of the building before, and were wondering why we were taking an 8-hour trip on a bus. And when you're there, you realize something that I was total surprise, was that it's also this incredible clay red. So it also has this incredibly visceral body presence. So it has this amazing refinement, kind of architectural refinement, but it also has this incredibly basic, visceral presence that at the time it reminded me of Joseph Beuys. You know, I can't rationalize that, but the kind of absolutely immediate pre-intellectual force that, say, a Joseph Beuys piece in Fat would have. So it has both of those things. Next thing I want to show, I'm going a bit slow, are 4 interiors by Adolf Loos from the beginning of the 20th century. Adolf Loos, another really great and very smart architect. Another object of research at the moment, because when I was at school, we of course heard about Loos as a proto-modernist, and in every history you had a photograph of the rear elevation of the Villa Steiner in Vienna, because it looked sort of modernist. But that is to totally misrepresent Adolf Loos. Adolf Loos was an architect, I think, totally enmeshed in the history of architecture. You know, he said when architecture loses its way, we can go back, you know, to the Romans. And even though we know that we're not Romans, that will root us again. But what I really like about Loos is his incredible sensitivity to the social mores of each of his projects, which is, to me, the opposite of a kind of very crude interpretation of modernism. So on the one hand, we have the Museum Café, beginning of the 20th century, a kind of classic Viennese cafe that changes its atmosphere from breakfast in the morning to, you know, having some schnapps at 2 in the morning, but quite a neutral space where all sorts of people can go. It's been restored recently and it's a bit sanitized, but you can still kind of get the idea. And almost at exactly the same time, the American Bar, you know, 4 blocks away, which is a real American whiskey bar, which of course today is a tourist destination, but at 2 in the morning starts to be a little bit debauched and maybe a little bit like what it was, you know, 100 years ago. And even today, when I was in Vienna with my family 2 Christmases ago, you felt very comfortable going for breakfast with our then 9-year-old son here, but you really didn't feel comfortable going into this bar, just because it's a bit small and tight, and although in Vienna there's absolutely no problem going with a 9-year-old into this space for a coffee, it didn't feel correct. And that's because of these kind of very strong signals that Loos's architecture is giving, which I think is an achievement. This is the living room in the Villa Müller in Prague, which is 1929. Same year as the Tugendhat house, which I also like, but an amazing, probably Loos's masterpiece, an amazing space, which on the one hand is like the hall of either a medieval or an arts and crafts English house, but on the other hand, because of all of these openings at the edges of the space with stairs going up to the kind of ladies' drawing room or the men's smoking room, is also exposing all of the kind of unwritten social structures of bourgeois society, kind of a Freudian, kind of very Freud-aware kind of domestic space, where you can get cozy or you can be formal, but because the cozy space overlooks the formal space, or the cozy space can be viewed from the formal space, the coziness is slightly disrupted, or maybe the formality is slightly disrupted, and very powerful. And finally, Loos's bedroom and Beethovenstrasse is, I guess, kind of the ultimate Freudian space, kind of the luxury erotic bedroom. It's hilarious, but also fantastic. Yeah. We can talk about Loos's love interest later, maybe. The last person I want to show is Sigurd Leverance. This is the Resurrection Chapel, in 1923, in the Woodland Cemetery, an amazing Corinthian temple. The view down in Allée, where Leverance is using the language of classicism. I could have showed Plečnik as well, the complete knowledge of that language, but then using the vocabulary of that language to extremes, subjecting them to the condition of this chapel in the cemetery, but I would also say subjecting classicism to the situation of the 1920s. So there's none of the kind of complacent, or you could say optimism, of a neoclassical building from, say, the beginning of the 19th century. This is a building where the classical architecture is squeezed and attenuated so that it's really rather desperate and very, very moving. On the left-hand side, you see these lines, which are extremely stretched pilasters, which, if they were a millimeter less, they wouldn't be there anymore. So it's like, at this time, in this place, classicism can only just assert its presence, but it does assert it. And in an equivalent way, in his late work, taking the syntax of architecture, so the idea of building in brick, in a kind of very typical brick for the south of Sweden, and totally transforming what that brick means. So the brick that, say, the National Romantic architects at the beginning of the 20th century would have used as a way of establishing a Swedish and Nordic architecture, Leverance using it again to quite neurotic and slightly extreme ends, kind of stretching the syntax of this construction so it almost hurts, So the joints in the brick sometimes are stretched, so you kind of feel a kind of tension in the mortar. And then in the even later building, the Flower Kiosk in Malmö, doing the same thing with a kind of absolutely banal cast concrete volume, where the joints in the plywood between these, between the shutters, the shuttering of the of the concrete, they come to a point which is so fragile that it breaks off, So the concrete is hard and rather brutal, but then the joints and the shuttering allow this sharp beak of leakage to come out, which actually undermines that weight and that solidity so that it feels fragile and vulnerable. Like Leverance felt, I suppose, when he was 83 years old working on this building for a cemetery. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm going to show some of our projects, which it's kind of I'm setting myself up for failure, by starting that way. So I think I'm showing 4 projects that are reasonably recent, although I'm aware that some of them are not so recent anymore, so next lecture I won't show any of these projects anymore. The first one is a project we did at the Museum of Childhood, which was finished a few years ago now. I'm showing, this is 2 plates from Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament, a very important English book about architecture by Owen Jones, who is an architect and a teacher at the South Kensington schools, which looked at ornament but with a particular bias to pre-Renaissance and even non-European forms of ornament. Owen Jones Owen Jones wrote another book about the Alhambra, for instance. He was very interested in Moorish architecture. And he was making connections between kind of Occidental and Oriental architecture, which was very interesting then and I think is interesting now as well. The connection with the Museum of Childhood is the Museum of Childhood was the original building of the Victoria and Albert Museum, the South Kensington Museum, which was then moved to East London in the 19th century. It's still part of the V&A, and its facades were designed by J.W. Wilde, who was Owen Jones's brother-in-law, and who shared many of these interests. And we had to do a restoration of the building and an addition. And there's another addition which I think will never happen. So the building is a quite amazing proprietary iron structure, kind of an iron structure bought out of a catalog and assembled, which we did a little bit of work on. Before we did this project, I always thought this building was a railway station, because it's very close to our office, that was disused. But actually, it's the first purpose-built museum in Britain. It was a building built to be a museum. The body of the building is the original part. The J.W. Wilde originally, I should have brought a slide of it, planned a tea room and a foyer and things like that out front. But typically, it's typical with English projects, they ran out of money, so they never built those things. So when we did this project in the last few years, we added a building on the front, which provided a foyer, toilets at lower level. We also we evened out all of the levels of the building so you could just come in if you're in a wheelchair or pushing your child in a buggy. Yeah. So that's the section with the new part in the front. So that's the front of the building. We made a new space in the front, which negotiates the change of level from the pavement up to the building. And then we made this new facade, a new porch, which is has a primitive Italian Renaissance flavor to it. So you can see the trabeation, but it's very, very flat. Like San Miniato or, say, Alberti's facade for Santa Maria Novella. That point in Renaissance architecture when classicism was only just being rediscovered and the architecture was in equal parts Gothic and classical. And trying tonally to make something which was coherent with the red brick and mosaics of J.W. Wilde's facade, which you can see beyond. It's also, this facade is a kind of imperial facade, an homage to the imperial origins of the V&A. So the stones, stones come from many different places. So there's limestone, that's English, but then there's quartzites that are from Brazil, and porphyries, and then another kind of quartzite that's from France. So coming from all different places. And then a kind of sign which is a bit like an LED sign but done in stone in lapis lazuli here. And it's making this kind of picture of a classical colonnade, but everything's completely flat. It's the first time we ever used stone, which was quite interesting. And then it goes into the building. There's no gap between old and new. It just goes into the building. And actually, because we demolished a structure that was here before, this pilaster and all of these moldings are new. So we just kind of copied and pasted what was down the building over there to make this corner, and then our building goes in at a kind of an appropriate molding level. And of course, in 5 or 10 years' time, there'll be nothing new about our addition, which is one of the reasons I'm not very interested in old and new, because new always becomes old. And in 100 years, our addition will be almost as old as the old building, for practical purposes. There's also precast concrete, and glass, obviously, and they're all flush. So it's like a kind of marquetry in stone. There's the sign. And then inside, it makes a foyer, and the outside is red, so the inside is green, according to Victorian color theory, which uses contrasting colors to make a kind of visual energy. And the roof structure, in order to have some coherence with the magnificent iron roof structure of the existing building, is in laser-cut steel, very, very thin blades, and painted gold. The terrazzo floor, which leads to a stair where you go down to a lower ground level, which is here, where there's toilets and education rooms and office and access to the office and the storage. And then upstairs, we reinstalled the whole of the collection. It's one of the great collections of toys and things about childhood in the world. It's in a vast collection with a very varied audience, because obviously it's very popular with kids, but there's also scholars who come to study the collection. And we rehoused the objects in some new cabinet. We actually, I'll show you here, we used old cabinets that were designed by Aston Webb 100 years ago for his addition to the V&A. So we went to the V&A stores and we took as many of these as existed, restored them and built a new interior architecture for them, but we soon ran out of them. So then we designed new vitrines with their own interior architecture. So this is at the mezzanine level. And then in the central hall, we designed these enormous pieces of chocolate-colored fiberglass furniture for the reception and the shop and the cafe. Okay, the second project is a project that's just about to go on site in Zurich. It's kind of finally getting to do a commercial office building. It's something we've been trying to do for years, to do a kind of normal building, something we're interested in, to do a part of the city which isn't that important, which is just a regular part of the city. The last few years, teaching in Zurich, there's a number of people on faculty there who are real experts about 20th century Milanese architecture, which in Britain is unknown. I don't know in Belgium if it's known or not. Maybe you can tell me after. But it's an incredible legacy of urban architecture right the way through the 20th century, starting with people like Muzio and Ponti. This is one of 60 buildings by Asnago Vender in Milan. Typically buildings that have offices on the bottom, housing on the top. A more famous example, the Torre Velasca by BBPR, really amazing building, but also offices and apartments. And then the building that we're doing, which is just near the main station in Zurich, which is a 30,000 square meter building that has shopping, offices, and then apartments in 2 towers. So kind of a figural building where the base of the building more or less conforms to the general height of the city in that area. And then there's 2 towers that come out which hold the apartments. This is from the competition like 2 years ago. This is a view where you can see the 2 towers. And here you can see it's part of a master plan by Kees Christianse. And this is our building is here. It's this one, which is at the crossing of this new street called Europaallee, very exciting, and Kanonengasse. And it's here. And actually, this building has been designed now, and this building. It's a kind of big development on rail lands. The main station is just here. There you can see. Our neighbors are, I can't remember which is which, but Gigon Guyer, David Chipperfield, and Max Dudler, and then this is a lot of Max Dudler here. Too much, arguably. So that's the ground floor of our building. It's quite complicated to do a building which is not enormous with all of these uses, with the cores and everything, but we managed. The office floors, not very exciting. And then the apartment floors, which are quite exciting. We're collaborating with friends of ours, Bossard Vake, and these are the penthouse apartments. They're really quite something. They're luxury apartments, and so they had to be something. But I'm not going to go into that now. So this is a model of the front part of the building, and you can see from the competition we had this idea of a kind of very strong tectonic identity to do with the piers holding the floors and the piers reducing as you go up the building. But in the process of developing the project and with the requirements from the letting agents for the apartments changing every 3 months, we realized that we had to introduce another order to take up the kind of flexibility that the apartments would need. So you can see that within this main tectonic structure, there's a secondary structure which up here starts to move around a little bit. So it has these two scales. And then actually on the ground floor, there's a further elaboration. And I'll kind of take you through those different parts. So that's the elevation. These are not absolutely current, but they're current enough. And the whole facade is in precast concrete, different forms. We were working very closely with Decomo from Flanders, who are very good precast concrete. I hope that they can get the job in Switzerland. Different forms of precast concrete. And the lower part, the facade is self-supporting. So there's no silicon in it. They're massive units which are sitting on top of each other with mortar joints. In the towers, they're hung, but our thinking was that the towers are much further away, so the way the joints are made is less of a real problem. So this is the facade along Europaallee. It's the other facade. And I'll just go around the building. It's a kind of crazy, the amount of variety in this building for a developer building. So you have an arcade at the end, which is part of the master plan, with a cafe. That's where Kanonengasse comes in. There's the entrance for the main office tenant. There are the entrances for the apartment buildings, and then there's the retail. So that's the cafe, where the green precast is like a curtain which is hanging within the primary structure of the building. These are the shop units. I think I have a detail later, and the residential unit. The main entrance for Swiss Canto. It's rented already, the building. So these are some details. So that's the precast for the cafe with these giant sash windows in gold anodized aluminium. And the paving of the arcade. This is the entrance to the apartments. So in a kind of beige with a sandstone that's similar to the sandstone in Zurich. And the retail facades with a brown, highly polished precast with these column-like elements in green polished precast and gold anodized. No, actually that's old. They're not gold anodized anymore, the doors, but yeah. And that's going up the building. So the office elevations, where you can put a partition on the 5.6 5.8 or the 2.6 module. And then you can see upstairs how this green element, well, it's not moving around yet, here starts to move around to take up partitions for bedrooms or to make loges. Yeah. These are some mid-samples of the green elements, which are polished on the side and acid etched on the front, or sometimes vice versa, and the beige elements, which are acid etched or bush hammered sometimes. Really, the beams are really quite rough. I mean, precast is an amazing material now because the cement that they use, that it's self-compacting cement, so it's much denser than the precast of the 60s, and just the incredible control that you have. And the reason we're using precast rather than stone is that we could never do 10-meter elements in stone. It's impossible. Yeah, it would cost so much money that it would be ridiculous. But with precast, you can do it. And the precast has a strength, so it can work as a structure. And it's actually quite an economical material. It's a material we're using a lot on a number of projects. So that's looking up at the office and the residential windows. Okay. This is a project we did last year in Berlin, in the Neue National Gallery in Berlin, in the Mies building. This is Mies's famous velvet and silk exhibition for the Werkbund, and it was in a Messehalle in Berlin in the 1920s. This is the first exhibition in the Neue National Gallery in the 1960s, where using Mies's system of suspended partitions, which for a number of reasons went out of favor, but it, in terms of an installation was quite good. Maybe it's not that great for the painting. The problem with these exhibitions, one is that you would see people's legs on the other side of the paintings, which is a bit funny because it looks like the paintings have legs. But the other problem is that the roof, the large span roof of this building, deflects between, I can't remember, was 10 and 50 centimeters. So over the course of the day, the panels would move. So that was quite a big reason why they stopped hanging the exhibitions. But anyways, we did an exhibition. It was the first exhibition curated by Udo Kittelmann, who was then the new director of the National Galleries in Berlin. And it was a show called Nationalgalerie by Thomas Demand, who's a friend who we've done a number of collaborations with. And it was quite a special moment. It was the 40th anniversary of this building. It was the 20th anniversary of reunification, and it was the 60th anniversary of the DDR, all happening more or less at the same time. And the show was work by Thomas that dealt with the idea of Germany. And we wanted to make a show really working between showing Thomas's work, but also trying to make a show that really worked in the Mies building, because I've seen many shows in that building and most of them are quite bad upstairs because they either resort to a scenography or they leave it completely open, and sometimes that works, but often it doesn't. So using this idea of the curtains to make room-like enclosures, but also using the curtains to break away from the slightly relentless symmetry of the building. So one of the wooden cores was completely hidden behind this curtain, but we also added some wood panels so you kind of couldn't quite remember where the wood panels are in the original building. We worked with Kvadrat, the Danish textile company, to develop a special textile for the show and special colors, which Thomas was very involved in. And the third collaborator in the exhibition was Boto Strauss, who's a playwright, slightly controversial German playwright, who wrote captions for each of Thomas's works, which were displayed in vitrines near the works that were being described, which also form smaller versions of these books were the catalog. As you can see, we made curtains, but they're not hanging, they're actually sitting on the ground. So that's how we avoided the deflection problem. And there were 6.5 kilometers of fabric in the show. And people who visited the show, and it did feel this way, they felt like the space of the National Gallery had suddenly grown to be twice the space, because it had the scale, these room-like, the scale of rooms, rather than just being an open space. So you went around these brownish-green enclosures. Thomas even hung one piece on the stone, but it meant it was hung from the top because you're not allowed to fix into any part of it because it's a monument. And then at the center there was a single gold curtain that had 2 new pieces by Thomas on them, big pieces. And about 30% of the show were on curtains facing outwards, so you could, without even going in, see a lot of the work. And on the outside, we did an illuminated sign, a bit like in a petrol station, that says National Gallery, which I think is still up for the next shows. It was a real pleasure to do that. I mean, I love Mies, and it's a really special building, but to do something that really felt right for the building but made a very powerful exhibition was a great pleasure. And we worked about 1.5 years on that project. Okay, this is the last project. It's Nottingham Contemporary, which opened just over 1 year ago. This isn't Nottingham, this weekend there's a brilliant show at the Barbican about Trisha Brown, Laurie Anderson, Gordon Matta Clark, and art from downtown New York. And it was a really great show. And they had couple of rooms about food. This is a picture. This is on Green Street. Gordon Matta Clark, Carol Gooden, Tina Girouard, who ran this restaurant for a couple of years at the bottom of 112 Green Street, which was the first important artist-run space in downtown New York at the beginning of the 70s. And the reason I'm showing you this is because this kind of spirit of found spaces and of contemporary art practice that spans between the visual arts and more time-based art, that was what the program of Nottingham Contemporary was when we were invited to do the competition. It was a very special competition where I think 6 people were invited, but we didn't really do a design. We had to do an 1.5 hour presentation and interview process where they were really trying to find an architect who could help them develop the brief and then do the building. It was really special, kind of a real engagement with the client during the competition project. And we won the competition, helped them develop the brief, and then eventually built it. This is a piece by Carol Gooden, I think, at 112 Green Street. And this is Matta Clark installing his piece Walls Paper, also in 112 Green Street. Really beautiful piece. And this is a warehouse in the Lace Market in Nottingham, just a block away from our site. So I'm showing you these things because we showed these things at our interview, making this connection between the downtown New York scene, the situation in the program for Nottingham Contemporary, but also the fact that Nottingham in the late 60s and early 70s had a parallel visual and performance art scene in the Midlands group, a very important national and even international scene happening there. But the funny thing is that the Lace Market, the buildings, the cast iron buildings there, are very much like the buildings of Soho, say. Cast iron buildings for storage and for mechanically produced lace, which is how Nottingham became rich in the 19th century. This is our building, so you can see the site. This is a lace market, which is built on a sandstone escarpment. And then the center of the town is on an escarpment here, and then the castle is over here. And this is the floodplain of the River Trent. And our building has a lower part, which is like a body, which is following the escarpment and these lower warehouse buildings that are built into the rock. And then it has these two volumes on the top which relate to the warehouses which are in the lace market. So that was our topographical idea. And there's a change of level from the lowest level down here to the street, which is called high pavement of lace market, of 13 meters. So the building works between those two levels, and it's not a huge building. It's only 3,500 square meters, but it's doing rather a lot urbanistically for a building of that size. So that's a section. So that's one entrance at this main street of the lace market, which enters into the upper level of galleries, which are all top-lit. And then there's another entrance here through the cafe to another space, which is kind of the lower level. The lowest level is the loading and the services. So a lot of the building's underground. That's the other section. We rebuilt a stair which was very important in the 19th century, but it kind of become decrepit and compromised over the 20th century. This site was once the site of the town hall, but since the beginning of the 20th century was a railway cutting for a railway tunnel that stopped being used in the 1970s. So it was a hole, the site. Okay. And the plans are very different in every level. So the top level is a steel structure, and you can see that the walls are very thin. It's very sketchy. And you enter here I'll show you this sort of marquee space. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 galleries, and you could remove these walls if you wanted to, and they're all top lit. And here you see the stair going down. There's an intermediate level with education spaces and offices. And then the lowest level, which is all concrete because it's built into the ground, with another gallery performance space and the cafe and the lower yard at the bottom of the stair, where you can go down to the lowest level or up to this intermediate level. So it's like this kind of bridge structure as well as being a Kunsthalle. The outside at the bottom of the stairs, lower yard with the cafe, upper yard with its big overhang and the entrance from above. So the cladding, and at every landing level of the outside stair there's a kind of major level, so that's the offices. Yeah, and the previous one was the cafe. And at the top, I'll show you the entrance in a sec, this is a big 9-meter wide bay window which faces Weekday Cross, which is a medieval market space, and it's like this giant eye looking to the center of the town. That's the entrance. So often when I was presenting this project to politicians and such like, I would talk about this overhang as being like the first gallery. It's a Kunsthalle that shows contemporary art, and that maybe you just meet a friend here and you'd have a look inside and it looked a bit intimidating, so you just carry on. But maybe 2 or 3 days later you'd actually get the courage to go in and see the exhibition. But even from here, you can look into all of the galleries of that floor, so you've already started to engage with what's happening in the building. So that's a view from under the overhang looking into the kind of the foyer space, and you see a gallery there, and there's a gallery there, and you can see a gallery over there. That's the wind lobby, which looks directly into a gallery. And then we're in these top-lit galleries. This is the first show was Francis Stark and David Hockney from the 60s, 2 shows that were about California in a way. This is the front gallery with the big bay window, which doesn't have these repetitive roof lights, but it's 10 meters high and has a massive single roof light and this big window. Other galleries on the top level. And sort of looking out. Going down then into the concrete body of the main part of the building. and then arriving at this big space, which is like a found space. It's very odd, and it feels like it was some space that used to hold some big storage facility or machines for manufacturing, but we actually designed it. And it has a very deep beam structure because we transfer the structure from the top level, and within that 1.5 meter depth is a full theatrical rig. So they have contemporary dance here, artist cinema season, but for 2 of the shows, they've also installed this space as part of the show. And then moving south towards the other entrance is the cafe, which we designed in collaboration with Matthew Brannan, and a very hot New York artist who designed the fabric for the curtains and these various accoutrements on the wall, which were about dining, but with a slight kind of sexual edge at times. And it's kind of become it's in a very busy part of Nottingham, so it's very well located in terms of having a bar and a restaurant, and it's become kind of the place where artists and people to do with culture meet and have a good beer or a coffee or whatever. And the opening hours for the cafe are longer than the opening hours for the galleries. And then just a little bit about the outside of the building. So this is a very charming view of this escarpment thing I was talking about with the castle, the way it's built up, from the river. This is a drawing we did at the competition, just about this thing which connected with this level, but also would connect with this level. And that's it. The kind of, after 2.5 years, how that turned out. But then also this idea, this idea of this kind of textile facade. At the competition, we talked about lace because we're building in the lace market. And then for about 6 months, we dropped it, and I thought that's too stupid an idea. And then thought, actually, it's a good idea because everybody will understand why the lace is there because we're in the lace market. So these are a small selection from the vast collection that Nottingham Trent University has about Nottingham lace. And the lace we chose was this one, which is called Cherry Blossom, which is a edging lace. That's it. It took us months to figure out how we were going to transfer the lace pattern into the concrete, and we did various experiments, but it was in the end very simple. We found a software that transferred a high-res scan of the lace into 3 dimensions, and we could control the depth of the 3D model just by contrast between white and black, which we could just manipulate in Photoshop. And then that was used to drive a CNC milling machine to do positives, from which we made a latex mold in Germany and then made the concrete. So in the end, it was very simple, but it took a long time to figure that out. So this is a model of how we would use it. So we're using the cherry blossom vertically on these scalloped units, so they look a little bit like vines growing up a wall or like frost forming. The precast units are actually double, so they're like 1.6 meters. But then at the joints and at the false joints, there's golden anodized aluminium capping, so that the rather large tolerances you have with precast, which are, say, 17 millimeters, are mastered by the capping. So the whole thing feels absolutely precise. There's no silicon, there's no gaps. So that's looking up Middle Hill, the long elevation, mostly just seeing the scalloped, sitting on a base of polished black precast. And then a detail at special points like the entrance in the south elevation, the lace takes over the whole of the surface, and the finished precast units were far better than any of the prototyping we did. You can see every fiber in the weave, and you feel the tension in it. Of course, the pattern of the lace is about 2.5 times the real scale, but we wanted the scale to feel correct. We didn't want it to feel like a kind of Andy Warhol pop version of lace. We wanted it to feel correct the way the Sullivan that I showed at the beginning of the lecture felt. Correct scale, and I think it does. And then finally, this was at the opening of the British Art Show, an amazing piece by Matt Derbyshire, kind of a very good young British artist who was given the bay window, and he made a piece specifically for it, which was like a furniture showroom window display. And just a fantastic piece in the window. And the party at the end on Lower Yard, you can see the people stuffed into the lower yard, smoking, I suppose. And another artist sign, this Las Vegas sign by Mark Gubb, which kind of points to Nottingham Contemporary. That's it. Thank you.
Est-ce que c'est possible de mettre un peu plus de lumière sur le public?
Et moins sur moi.
So as announced before, we will have a short discussion with the public. If you feel like, of course. Is there anybody who wants to open the discussion with a question?
Hello, you mentioned it in your introduction that architecture is one of the arts. I'd like to ask you the question, do you really think that architecture is an art?
I do, yes. I mean, clearly you're skeptical. Definitely, because architecture is a repository for culture. It holds social memory. It works and brings together iconography or semiotic issues with material, and to me that's art. Yeah, that's the same things a painter or a sculptor does. I'm not saying it's exactly the same as gallery-based art. Gallery-based art, and I'm a huge consumer of art, especially contemporary art, but all art. I did art history before I did architecture. I'm very, very interested in art. Of course, working in a gallery allows you to be more intense, more extreme, because you're doing something in an insulated place. You can be more extreme. It's not permanent. You can be more polemical. Maybe you can even make work about bad things. I don't think it's ever justified to make architecture about bad things. I think architecture does have a responsibility to be constructive because it takes a huge effort. It's there for the long term. So I think it's different. It works differently than the other arts, but I think they work differently from themselves also. So I do. I think it's an art. That's why I'm interested in it. Of course, the vast majority of building has nothing to do with architecture. That's always been the way, and it always will be the way. The slightly disappointing thing about today is how many famous architects, many of whom are also involved in academia, are really just doing commercial architecture. That's quite a new thing. It's quite a new thing. And it's not that great. Any other? I know there's some very smart people in the audience, but I don't want to force you. Oh, there's somebody there. Good.
Architects and architecture and this speech that you just gave. How did you actually find the experience of doing a large project with all of the constraints involved, like the project that you did in Zurich? Because I think I speak for many when I say that, like, as an architect, you enter into a project with great aspirations for what it could be, and then the pressure of, I suppose, budget, client demands, timetables, seems to kind of push a lot of this down. How did you find that you had to compromise in this project because of this?
Okay. I mean, it's not an accident that the first commercial building we do is in Zurich. Because we've done office buildings in London, one of which might still get built, but we got planning permission on a building and then the client sold the site. So it's sort of events overtake it. In Zurich, there's this very clear structure. There's a master plan. There's a competition for the master plan, which defines the Gestalt plan. So it's very clear what each plot will have. There's a competition for the building, if it's a big building. There's a construction industry that's able to build very high quality buildings for a kind of reasonable budget. And this is a big it's a relatively large building in a very important master plan where the Baukollegium of the city, where the Baurat of the scheme, like there were a number of levels of architects looking at the project to make sure that the quality of the whole master plan site was retained. So there was a lot of pressure on the developer to deliver quality. And they were interested in that too, because it's a location where they can get top rents for the offices and for the apartments. I don't feel and the client's not easy. The director in charge of the project, very neurotic guy, who's nice because he really cares, and he made us redo a lot of things. But I would say that almost all of those iterations improved the project because we also really stood our ground about what was important, and he respected us. And as long as we performed, we have a timetable. When we won the competition, it was clear when the building has to be finished. And it was clear that the building has to start on site in September this year. And all of that will happen. So that's the deal we have to keep. And there was a budget. But if you keep that part of the deal, and you do the office space that's efficient, and you do the apartments that work according to the people who have to rent the apartments, all of which are parts of the situation of building a commercial building, then you can do the architecture that you want to do. If we would fail on any of those things, we would have to either compromise or we would be fired. That's clear. So I think every project has challenges. Like 60-70% of our work is to do with arts institutions, and it's very different, but you still have the pressures of budget, you still have a demanding client, you still have a brief which changes while you're in detailed design. And I guess Peter and I in our practice, we always, from very early on, we wanted to be able to do the architecture that we wanted to do, which is what you're asking. And our view was, in order to do that, we had to be more professional than a commercial architect. And our office is very organized. We're very efficient. Our fees are not low. Our fees are high or medium. And that's how we can afford to work on projects so much. But we're not prima donnas. I have no patience for architects who are prima donnas. Because if you're a prima donna, and you're kind of doing this, and you're missing deadlines, and you're being told that, the apartment that you've planned is kind of has 20% too much circulation and they won't be able to rent it, and you just ignore it, well, then you're not doing. And that's the easy part of architecture, to deal with those demands. The difficult part of architecture is to think what the theme of the project is, because it's a commercial building, because it's in that place, and then to think about how to materialize those themes. So we also walk away from projects. We often, after a first or second meeting with a client, can tell if it's not going to go well. And then we excuse ourselves from the project, because we don't want to do projects that we're embarrassed by, where we have to make excuses. And so far we've managed to do that. We make demands of our clients, but they make demands of us, and that's how it should be, I think. I don't think projects that have no constraints, they're very rarely good. I think the constraints of a project, the difficulties in a project, are what give projects energy and tension, and those constraints are financial, they're about planning, they're about all of the politics that goes with approvals. On Nottingham, I had to meet every member of the planning committee, every politician, and some of them didn't even want to be in a room with me, but I had to meet with these people, because that was the only way we knew we would get permission, and we got permission. So, and after 20 years, people know what they're getting also. It's harder when you're starting. We had our 20th anniversary last year of our practice, and people know what they're getting now. They can talk to other clients, and most of our clients we're still in touch with. Several of them are friends now. We have some like Gagosian Gallery who we haven't stopped working for the last 12 years. We're always working for them. So, people know, they know what they're getting now. So either they want it or they don't,
Could you maybe elaborate on your or maybe Peter St. John's fascination for the use of the golden aluminum frames for the windows? Or I saw them in many of your projects, or your projects tonight, all of them, but also in the Chiswick Cafe. And
Yeah. Gold is the most beautiful color. Everybody loves gold, huh? And it's true that we've done a number of projects that are black, green, and gold. And I don't know if it's not necessarily to do with my love of reggae music, but there's a kind of luxury about gold, which is, it's very communicative, but it's also funny, it's witty, huh? And I think in Nottingham, for instance, it's to do with that. It's having these gold things, like what could be more bling, And so much contemporary art is skirting with, what's good taste, what's bad taste. I'm very interested in that edge. Good taste is so easy and so boring. What's challenging is to be close to vulgarity. And I think art has often been on that edge. So I like things that are close to that edge. And it's looking at, like those buildings from Milan, which also use maybe kind of bronze or an anodized color. There's something slightly retro in it for sure. And we'll get over it and we'll move on, But I remember with Chiswick, when I was at school at McGill, the kind of special building that was being done then in Montreal, and there are not so many special buildings in Montreal, was the world headquarters for Alcan, for the big aluminium company. And one of our professors was developing the cladding system, and it was aluminium, of course, and it was anodized in a special color called champagne, which was invented for the Alcan headquarters. And we used that on Chiswick. It was a dream since I was a student, you know. I don't have a gold watch, though, you know, so I am a bit of a hypocrite, really.
Hi. So you've been talking about Semper and then Sullivan laws, and obviously you're very interested in ornamentation. And the same feeling in the research and the project you show, it seems that you're trying to bring in this ornamentation into the material itself, like the last project you showed with the lace and how you're trying to put it in depth in the concrete. So my question would be, what's the depth you would see, and how do you perceive it in the ornamentation? Obviously, it's more than just cladding.
The interest in ornamentation is, it kind of connects to the title, Almost Everything. You know, what we're using things like that in our architecture because architecture that we really love also uses it. Yeah, so it's a reference to that architecture, and it's trying to make a connection to the work of Sullivan and Loos and Plechnik and people like that. But also, why shouldn't you use ornament now? Like, why is it acceptable to kind of, why is it even interesting to say that parametrics are the new paradigm for architecture, you know, which to me is totally ridiculous. What do parametrics even have to do with architecture? I understand what parametrics are. I understand how they're useful in assessing certain criteria that architecture is involved in. But how do parametrics underlie a kind of new architecture? It's absurd to me. And it's the same with how does Deleuze and folding relate to architecture? You know, it's such a kind of banal and kind of direct translation of something from another discipline into architecture. Architecture is, Western architecture is 2,500 years old, you know, and the temples in Paestum have ornament on them. They're carved. They have ornament according to the Doric order. And, you know, I think that that has a lot more authority than any of these other things. It's not that I'm closing my eyes to the other things, but there's something kind of deep in the culture of architecture that we should be engaging with, and which architects have, if you take 2,500 years of Western architecture, that for, you know, 2,430 of those years, architecture has been about those things. You know, and to me, a very narrow and caricature version of modernism, which is sort of what people think of as modernism, is an aberration. That's what I think. Because during modernism, there were all sorts of other things happening which were also modern, which didn't deny all of those things, which didn't rely on a rupture from the culture of architecture. So, I don't know if I'm answering your question. You're talking about the depth of it. Like, I'm interested in everything to do with the culture of architecture. But then one has to find how those things are relevant to the task now. So Nottingham is not cast terracotta. Because to make terracotta, I love terracotta, Walsall is clad in terracotta. But to make terracotta with a pattern like we did at Nottingham, would require an enormous number of hours of labor. Yes, you would need to make wooden molds. They couldn't be 14 meters long, obviously. You'd have to take the clay, punch the clay into the molds, fire them. It's a hugely lengthy process which requires a lot of human labor. Human labor is very expensive now. Yeah? The system we use with the precast required a minimum of hand labor. It required a certain amount. I mean, we worked with the professor of textile design at University of Derby to work on the rescaling and the CNC milling of the pattern. But to me, it's very important that that ornament, which formally is very close to the Sullivan, that was the intention. Its materialization, though, had an equivalent relationship to the contemporary construction industry, to Sullivan's, to the relationship that Sullivan's use of terracotta had to the late 19th century construction industry, where clearly labor was very cheap, yeah, and where the terracotta was a relatively economical material. Although that said, Sullivan's terracotta was pretty expensive because only one person could make it because it was so elaborate. But terracotta generally was like cheap stone. Yeah, so it's not just, there's a formal idea, and a formal idea that relates to certain cultural issues in architecture, but then the materialization has to have a realism to it, or else it becomes a kind of fantasy or a vanity. And that's a kind of careful judgment, I think. Yeah, and it's not that our buildings are easy to build, they're rather difficult to build. So it's not about difficulty, but it's about that the difficulty is in an area where the contemporary construction industry should be able to achieve something. Yeah, not to ask the contemporary construction industry to do something that the industry 150 years ago would do. If you're restoring an old building, the rules change a little bit. Yeah, and so then maybe you do need to remake something using a historic technique. So, and a lot of our projects are in historic buildings, so using materials like fibrous plaster, things like that. It's very interesting. But there the project is also kind of legitimizing using those techniques. Maybe I answered your question. Maybe only one more because I'm getting tired.
As you mentioned, the amount of cultural buildings you have done and your interest about art, I would like to ask about relation between architecture and art, but art is exposing art. What do you think about the importance of context of art and making architecture for it? As it seems that definition of museum seems to change, and that how it seems to be in last centuries, as new media has exploded in a very new, flexible way, and your architecture seems to be more monumental and durable. How do you find the importance between those?
There's two questions there. I mean, the first thing is the relationship of my justification for the validity of looking at 19th century architecture would be, if you go see the Luc Tuymans show here, Luc Tuymans is a painter who makes representational paintings. How come that's okay? Yeah? How come that's okay, but architecture still has to profess a rupture to its history? So that's the relationship of those disciplines. I think the answer is that painters are more intelligent than architects, or architects are stupider than painters. So they still think that novelty is something to aim for. I think the most flexible buildings are buildings that have a variety of robust, generous spaces. I don't think that time-based, lens-based art requires very different spaces from paintings. I think that's a big fiction that certain architects like to perpetuate so that they can make crazy buildings. The Pompidou Center, it was designed, Pompidou Center, their display idea is exactly like Mises' display idea in the Neue National Gallery. They made these vast loft-like spaces with no structure, for no particular, and I like the Beaubourg, I think it's an amazing place. And I visited it once before they remade all the interiors. So I saw one show on screens. And you can't show most art on screens. Yeah, so this idea that you have to make vast column-free spaces that are totally flexible, that kind of flexibility makes every exhibition unbelievably expensive to put on. So in the end, what they've done with the Beaubourg is they've made almost scenographic suites of 19th century enfilade galleries in the loft space, which is not that satisfying. I think what show couldn't be put on in an amazing warehouse building? Why is it that artists since the 60s have found so much resonance with found space? I mean, the program of Nottingham Contemporary was the potential of found space and how you could make a new building that had something of the wild range of spatial character that an existing building has. And I've seen amazing shows. You go to Dia Beacon, an hour north of New York City, which is in a box factory, a vast box factory which has been very lightly renovated for this amazing collection of 60s and 70s conceptual art. In the basement, where there's lots of columns, the lower level, you have this amazing installation of Bruce Naumann's. It's the best place to see Donald Judd and Chamberlain and all those people, and there's nothing about those spaces that would stop you showing, Douglas Gordon or whoever. Okay, you need to be able to black out the spaces. That's quite easy. Most galleries can be blacked out. Maybe not all, I think what's funny is this orthodoxy of top-lit galleries. I think you don't need all galleries to be top-lit. Not all galleries need natural light. That's true. But if you make them big enough, and you have a variety of top-lit, side-lit, and not-lit galleries, there's no show that you wouldn't be able to put on. And I think most institutions have completely gone away from the idea of, movable partitions and all of that, because it's very expensive to do it so that they actually make good walls, or the walls are really not good enough to hang on, and artists and curators aren't satisfied to hang on those walls. They're flimsy, they're not tall enough, etc., etc. I think that was kind of a modernist dream also. The flexibility. It's like you don't need to live in a house, as much as I like the Schroeder house, and I do, you don't need to live in a house where all the walls are flexible, so that when your child is 3 years old, it has one configuration, and when they're 10 years old, it has another configuration. And then when they move away, you have another. That's not necessary, When they move away, their bedroom can become a study, or there's all sorts of easier ways of dealing with the passage of life than moving walls. Okay. Thank you.